Good evening, and thanks for coming to this pre-concert talk with KHFM. I'm Brent Stevens. We want to thank Kelleher and McLeod, who sponsored these talks all season. We seem to be getting more and more people. Yes, give them a hand. We're getting a few more people each time. Tell your friends next season. Theoretically, next season we will have a new music director in place, so great opportunity to come hear more about the music and about the programs. And of course, you can always hear more on KHFM. If you don't know me, I'm Brent Stevens, and I'm on from 6 to 10 weekdays on Weekday Mornings with Brent. This concert is part of the New Mexico Philharmonic's Music and Arts Festival, which actually started earlier today and continues through May 1st with events through this week and next weekend. You're going to want to check that out. There are flyers. If they're not in your program book, there are some on the tables. And the theme is migration. And this concert and the week coming up certainly have a great deal to do with that. We have two wonderful guests tonight, and I'd like to bring them out. Conductor Roberto Minchuk and violinist Jennifer Coe. So we're going to start by talking Brahms. Brahms' Violin Concerto, like many pieces not well received by critics at the time, has of course become one of the staples of the repertoire. Brahms wrote this piece in collaboration with his great friend, the violinist Joseph Joachim, took a lot of advice from him. One of the criticisms of the work at the time was that it was, I think the quote is, it was a concerto for the violin against the orchestra, instead of for the violin with the orchestra. Would you like to comment on that at all?
I don't know. I think it's in that kind of great literature vein of Bildungsroman, where the consciousness is so clear upon the main character, and even their subconscious is interwoven throughout. So if you're kind of from that tradition, if you're talking about Thomas Mann, or if it goes, into the French tradition as well with Stendhal, or so it is a very heroic thing, but the hero of the novel or the hero of the concerto is kind of clear, but that never means life doesn't ever come without struggle, in a sense, So I think that struggle, that journey that one emotionally goes through in the concerto that's a part of it, don't you think? It's kind of interwoven.
Absolutely, and it's so beautifully and perfectly written that it sounds like a symphony, and it feels like a symphony with a violin obbligato a lot of the times. Brahms really is the most, I would say, or probably the most unanimous composer amongst us musicians, because his music is both intellectual and perfect. If you analyze the score, and also it's just so emotional and so beautiful. And in the case of the concerto, musicians, every single line, the second violin, the third horn, the violas, the cellos, it's so beautifully written that everybody feels that they have the main line. And you almost end up forgetting it's a violin concerto after all.
In fact, in the second movement, that's another complaint that violinists have had. One of the most beautiful melodies Brahms wrote, and it's for the oboe at the beginning of the movement.
Exactly. And oboe completely steals the show right there.
Not for too long.
Not for too long, just for the introduction. And then comes the beautiful violin solo.
Jennifer, I want to ask you a question. I was here for the first rehearsal the other day, and I've never seen a soloist do this before. I'm not a violin player, so I would think I would spend my entire time during that introduction thinking double stops. You brought out a score, and you seemed to be just casually reading along the orchestra score as it went along, and then set it down, and then flamed away with it. So is that a regular practice with you?
She was just checking on me if I was doing everything right,
I don't know. I mean, I study scores all the time. I work with a lot of composers, and my favorite thing is, getting together with composers and we go through scores. And it's not just, violin concerti. It's opera scores and symphonic scores. And it's just really fun to see how first of all, how every composer notates very specifically for themselves, and you come to an understanding of their language, I think, that way. And I mean, in terms of, playing a violin concerto, it's just, I think one of the greatest things about music is that you're part of something so much larger and so much greater than just yourself. And so even though it's called a violin concerto and, by name I'm called the soloist, it doesn't exist without every single person on stage. So you're really part of this much larger organism. And so I'm always aware of that. And I think in any case, and I tell this to kids when I do education programs, being a great musician, it's 99.999% how you can hear and how you can listen and how you respond. It's not what you're actually physically doing on your instrument. So, like all the practicing and stuff, you do that so that you can be very present in that moment, and you try to share and communicate that not only with your fellow musicians, but with the audience, ultimately.
That's interesting you say that about reading scores, because I do have friends who our idea of a good time would be to get together and put on a Mahler symphony and read the score at the time. By the time you finish the bottle of wine, sometimes you can't get all the way through it. But music is such a visual language on the page as well, and to see the beauty of the way the composer does drop themes in a violin concerto, seeing the way those nuggets are laid throughout the
For Mahler, you'll
organ.
see how anal he was. He was like, no, it can't be like this. And you just feel like he's been traumatized by bad performances. And he's like, no, this must not be.
But it is most interesting. I happen to collect many facsimile of manuscripts, especially those of Johann Sebastian Bach, because I lived in Leipzig for a number of years, and it's amazing. And I have facsimiles of Mozart's scores and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and it's amazing how you see the process of composing. Beethoven would correct a lot, and a lot of it you can't really understand.
He made holes because he'd be so angry. He was crossing out that he actually would make holes in the paper. It's amazing.
But the most beautiful autographs are Bach's. You hardly see any corrections at all, as if the music had just been dictated to him and he was just writing. And there are hardly any corrections. Every single note is perfect from the start. It is quite impressive.
There's one more thing I want to say, and we're going to let you go because you have some warming up to do. But the other thing that struck me about the rehearsal is you place yourself in the orchestra. Most soloists will tend to be downstage a little bit, and you insist on being in the orchestra and a part of that sound. Is that part of the communication of the piece to you?
I don't know. I've just always done that. It feels really weird to be, separated off in another area. I feel like everything is about communicating and being able to see not only Roberto, but the other musicians. And, we're all part of this larger organism that we're kind of putting together communally to create this communal experience. So, I don't know, for me it just would seem weird if I was just all the way forward on stage, but that's just me, I guess.
I have to say, it is quite wonderful to be able to have that connection with the soloist, because she's right there, she's observing every phrase and who has the line, and she is almost playing chamber music with the musicians, and that's a wonderful feeling, to have.
The rehearsals are really something to see because, and you're not the only soloist who, a lot of it is turning around and playing with the orchestra, so they can hear you and you can hear them and you hear all the interaction.
Yeah, and I have to say it's been a pleasure working with Roberto because he's such a generous musician, and I can just feel him feeling every phrase together, which is really a pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, we will let you go.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to it. Jennifer Coe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Roberto, first let's talk about samba, which is a piece I don't know.
Alexander Levy was a fabulous composer from my hometown, São Paulo, Brazil. And he wrote this in 1890, which makes him a contemporary of both Brahms and Dvorak. The symphony, the New World Symphony, was written in 1893. So I'm pretty sure that he was familiar with both Brahms and Dvorak's music, and he is influenced, of course, by the music of Europe. And like many composers of his time, he was taking the music of his own country and the tradition, the dances, the folk music, and putting that into a symphonic context. And this is what he did with this samba. This samba is part of a Brazilian suite, so it's the final movement of this suite. And it's a wonderful, I'd say very true to the samba rhythms, but it sounds like a Bruckner, and how can that be? You know, a samba with that kind of Germanic European tradition. So it's a fun piece to open the program, and it is a contemporary of the both Brahms and Dvorak that we're listening to tonight.
And you mentioned folk music. Dvorak brought a lot of the spirit of his country and of this country into his works, but he wasn't really an ethnomusicologist. He didn't find folk tunes and try and weave them in. He created melodies that had the feel or the essence of them. Dvorak was in America in the 1890s. A rich woman had established a conservatory in America for music with the idea of bringing him over. He was only able to travel with his wife and two of his children. So I think you hear this in the symphony, this immigrant in America who is creating some of the best music of his life, but there's a longing always to go back to his homeland.
Absolutely. In the case of Symphony from the New World, he actually took themes from American songs and spirituals, like in the Going Home, in the case of the second movement with the beautiful English horn solo, and dances, folk dances, and he transformed that into this magnificent symphony. And from the very first note of the first movement to the last note of the last movement, you always have these themes reappearing, coming back in different forms, you know, in a very powerful way by the brass, or in a very subtle way with just the English horn solo. So it's amazing what he was able to do. But you're right, he remained a true Slavic throughout. You know, you cannot deny that this music is pure Slavic music, with all the wonderful flavor and color that Dvorak brings to his music.
Where's your family from?
Well, I'm a second generation Brazilian. My grandparents came from Belarus and from Poland, from my father's side, and they came from a place called Bessarabia, which would be Moldavia nowadays. So my father was born in 1937 in São Paulo, but interestingly enough, they went back to Poland in 1938. So he lived the entire World War in Europe, and then finally, when he was 12 years old, 1949, they came back to Brazil and settled São Paulo. So I was born in São Paulo, and then I moved to New York at age 14 to study at Juilliard.
New York for the foreigner. Now, Dvorak, this work was premiered, the New World Symphony, by the New York Philharmonic in Carnegie Hall. Dvorak was, of course, in the audience, and they had to stop after every movement for standing ovations, and the composer had to stand and bow. Everyone knows the great theme of Going Home, but to me, there is so much rich music in this symphony. The scherzo is fantastic. I think the fourth movement is, well, like you say, right from the very beginning, he grabs you. Is there a movement that you love more than any other?
I don't think so. They're so unique, and each movement is a masterpiece. But I don't know if you noticed the very beginning of the finale, the fourth movement, I think that's where John Williams got his inspiration for Jaws.
Ba-da-da-dum.
Yes.
Slow it down,
I'm
yes.
convinced. You know, those two notes, very aggressive. Well, and I like that. I like John Williams too.
And John Williams would probably acknowledge that if he did. The other thing, the symphony ends slowly, softly. Rather than a big crescendo after all that we've been through, he brings it back to an ending of introspection again.
Absolutely. That's a very courageous ending. But I think he felt he had said everything. There was enough powerful moments there that he could really just have the sunset at the end, you know, after a gorgeous, beautiful day.
Let's bring up the house lights if we can, and we can open this up to a few questions. Does anyone have any questions of Maestro Minchuk? Questions about the pieces? Really? Go ahead.
It could well be, because it's so beautiful. Traditionally, they associate the theme with the spiritual going home. And it has become such a tradition. This music is even played at funerals. But it could very well be that the spiritual came after Dvorak, was inspired by Dvorak.
The words were written later, and there's some debate, even among Dvorak's writings, of whether he really co-opted Negro spirituals and whether he really co-opted Native American music, or whether he made up those melodies. He did an interview sort of at the time with a New York paper saying, yes, I was greatly influenced by this, and later in his life he would write, no, I just made this stuff up based on influences. So that may have to do with time and memory, or it may well be that they were completely original melodies, just born of what his experience had been.
It reminds me of that question: does art imitate life, or life imitate art? At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter, right?
Do you have a favorite composer or composers, and do you compose?
The question is, do you have a favorite composer or composers, and do you yourself compose?
I have done some composing, especially in my younger days, and I enjoyed it very much. But after I was a full-time conductor, you know, in the last 20-some years, then I haven't really had time to devote myself to it. I even wrote the song for my wedding, and my wife is here today, and we sang our song. So it's something that I love to do. You need to be inspired. I'm not a professional composer. I really need to be inspired. But as a conductor, I can conduct under any circumstance at any time, you know, and I really love to do that. If I have a favorite composer, it's interesting, you know, because always as a conductor, you put yourself in the place of a composer when you're rehearsing the piece, when you're studying it, when you're conducting it, as if you have yourself created that piece. And that's the best way to really approach it, you know, to put yourself in the composer's place and see what was his real intention with this phrase. What is he trying to communicate? Even though a symphony has no text or words, there is always a story behind it. And even if there isn't one, it helps if you create one, because then you can really truly convey that to your musicians, what that means to you, and the audience will get it when it's performed passionately and with that kind of conviction and power. So I have to say that, you know, my favorite piece is Dvorak tonight when I was conducting Dvorak. But last week, Good Friday, I was conducting Bach's St. John's Passion. And that music is just so sublime, it's just so powerful. I was absolutely in love with that music, and it just stays with you for days and days. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But I would say that Johann Sebastian Bach, we wouldn't be here listening to Brahms and Dvorak was not for Johann Sebastian Bach establishing everything that music became. We owe it to Bach's music and how he organized music for us. You know, his legacy really is the most important in music, in Western music.
So I wanted to go from what you were talking about with the reading the scores and Mahler giving a lot of instructions on how basically micromanaging the piece.
Right.
Is there a composer who doesn't do that? And do you prefer having that level of line reading essentially, or do you prefer when a composer lets the notes speak for themselves?
You know, it's wonderful to conduct Mahler because Mahler, even before being a composer, he's a conductor. So he's one of the true cases of a conductor-composer, and he was a great conductor. A lot of composers also conducted, but weren't really, great conductors. So he is thinking, well, he's giving instructions to the conductor. Conduct this in 4, conduct this in 2. Just don't rush here. Don't drag. All in German. Nicht schleppen and nicht eilen, and all these instructions. It's wonderful to have these. But history tells us that one of Mahler's favorite conductors was Mengelberg from Amsterdam, from the Concertgebouw. In Mengelberg, he did everything contrary to Mahler's instructions. He would, it was his own friend, and he took great pleasure in just doing it completely different. And Mahler loved Mengelberg's interpretations. So I think when the music is played in a very powerful and convincing way, you can even do something different, and composers will enjoy that. So as music progressed, from classical period to romantic to 20th century, it became more complex, more instructions, and that's not necessarily better. We take each piece, each composer, for his own original way, and that's how I approach each one of them.
So Mahler, as a composer, brought a lot of his conducting to what he did. Dvorak, I believe, was a violist, played a lot of chamber music. I think he also played in theater and opera orchestras. So do we see that experience in his music?
We see that. It's a beautiful viola part. He was, thinking about his colleagues, probably wanting him to have a good time. But it's not so evident. I think when you see his music, it's overall is so well constructed. The architecture, the colors, and the orchestration, and everything is perfect. Even the tuba part in the New World Symphony, which doesn't play more than 10 notes total. You will notice that the tuba will only perform at the introduction of the second movement and the epilogue of the second movement. And you say, why bother, right? But he wanted that color. He wanted that depth of sound just for the chorale, the opening chorale of the second movement, and that's it.
That's in modern terms, that's the subwoofer that you put on, so you get that deep low, rich low.
Exactly.
Probably have time for one last question, if anyone has one. Okay, well, we would very much like to thank our conductor. Thank you all for coming. Really do recommend these to other people.
Thank you.
And I would highly suggest that you check out the rest of the Music and Arts Festival this week. There are events from jazz to music by chatter. There are theater events, there are lectures and demonstrations. Check it out, and if you don't take something home with you, check it out at NM Phil. Also, I know you'll be reminded of this, but go and vote. We're all expecting a new music director, and you are a part of the process next season. Maestro, thank you so
very
much.
much. Thank you. It's great fun.